In the east of Europe, upon vast plains, flows a mother river named the Dnieper. This land, renowned for its fertile black earth, has been a cradle of civilization since ancient times and a strategic prize for empires. It has witnessed the rise and fall of countless dynasties and borne the suffering and glory of nations. This is Ukraine, a country with a long history and unique culture, yet one that has endured immense hardship throughout the ages. Its story is a magnificent epic of survival, struggle, independence, and identity. Today, let us journey into this land, trace its long course from antiquity to the contemporary era, and feel its indomitable spirit and resilient vitality. Chapter 1: Ancient Footprints and the Dawn of Civilization. Traces of human activity on Ukrainian land can be dated back to the late Paleolithic period. Archaeologists have discovered Paleolithic settlements in Mezin and Kirilivska, dating back tens of thousands of years, unearthing stone tools, bone implements, and mammoth tusks with primitive carvings, indicating the early human habitation of this land. These early hunter-gatherers struggled against nature during the harsh Ice Age, laying the very first foundations for later civilizations. As the glaciers retreated, the Neolithic Age arrived. From approximately the 6th to the 4th millennium BCE, the renowned Tripilya-Kukutini culture flourished in the regions of modern-day Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania. The Tripilyan people were known for their exquisite painted pottery, massive concentric settlements, and developed agriculture and animal husbandry. Their settlements were astonishingly large, some capable of housing tens of thousands of inhabitants, making them Europe's earliest proto-cities. The spiral, animal, and human motifs painted on their pottery not only showcased a high level of artistic skill, but also embodied their understanding and worship of the cosmos, life, and fertility. They worshipped a mother goddess, practiced complex religious rituals, and their social organization had already taken on a complex form. However, this prosperous culture mysteriously declined around the mid-3rd millennium BCE, the reasons for which remain a puzzle debated by scholars, possibly related to climate change, resource depletion, or the migration of foreign tribes. Following the Tripilyan culture, the Ukrainian steppe witnessed a wave of Indo-European nomadic peoples. From the late 3rd millennium to the 1st millennium BCE, the Yamnaya culture, Kordadwar culture, and Shrubnaya culture, also known as timber grave culture, successively left their marks on this land. These cultures were characterized by their unique burial customs, use of bronze, and domestication of horses. They brought new technologies, languages, and lifestyles, profoundly influencing the formation of later European peoples. Entering the Iron Age, from approximately the 9th to the 7th century BCE, the Sumerians became the masters of the North Pontic steppe. They were formidable cavalry, mentioned even in Greek epics. However, their rule was not long-lasting. In the 7th century BCE, the Scythians, migrating from the east, replaced them, ushering in a glorious era of a nomadic empire in Ukrainian history. The Scythians were an Iranian-speaking tribal confederation of Indo-European origin, renowned for their superb equestrian and archery skills, unique animal style, gold art, and complex social structure. The Greek historian Herodotus, in his Histories, meticulously recorded Scythian customs, military strength, and social life. The Scythians controlled vast steppes from the Danube to the Don River and traded with Greek colonial city-states on the northern Black Sea coast, such as Olbia and Panacapaeum, exporting grain, furs, and slaves, and importing wine, olive oil, and handicrafts. The tombs of Scythian nobles, kurgans, have yielded numerous exquisite gold artifacts, such as combs, necklaces, and scabbards, whose masterful craftsmanship and vivid ornamentation are breathtaking, fully demonstrating the unique charm and wealth of Scythian culture. However, like all nomadic empires, the Scythian glory was not to last. Around the 3rd century BCE, another Iranian-speaking nomadic tribe, the Sarmatians, migrated from the east and gradually replaced the Scythians as the new masters of the North Pontic steppe. The Sarmatians were also excellent cavalry, and their women held a relatively high status in society, with some even participating in combat as warriors, which might be one of the origins of the ancient Greek legend of the Amazon warriors. Sarmatian rule lasted for several centuries, during which they had numerous conflicts and interactions with the Roman Empire. Meanwhile, in the forest and forest steppe zones, the ancestors of the Slavic peoples also began to form and develop. Archaeologically, cultures associated with the early Slavs include the Przeworsk culture and the Cherniakov culture. The Cherniakov culture, circa 2nd to 5th century CE, was widespread, from Romania to central Ukraine, exhibiting characteristics of multi-ethnic fusion, with Slavic tribes being an important component. During this period, the Goths also briefly established a kingdom on the North Pontic coast, exerting a certain influence on the local political landscape and cultural exchange. At the end of the 4th century CE, the westward migration of the Huns triggered the famous migration period in European history. The Hunnic cavalry swept across Europe, destroying the Gothic kingdom and also impacting Sarmatian rule. In this great turmoil, Slavic tribes began to expand massively westward, southward, and eastward. Among them, the Slavic tribes inhabiting present-day Ukraine were known as the Ontes and Sclavini. Byzantine historians like Procopius and Jordanes recorded the activities of these early Slavic tribes. The Ontes are considered one of the direct ancestors of the Ukrainian people. They formed a powerful tribal confederation in the middle Dnieper region and had military conflicts and diplomatic relations with the Byzantine Empire. By the 6th to 7th centuries, with the Avars and later the Khazars successively establishing khanates in the Eastern European steppe, the political landscape of the Slavic tribes evolved further. The Khazar Khaganate was a Turkic khanate that had adopted Judaism, controlling important trade routes in southern Eastern Europe, including part of the famous route from the Varangians to the Greeks. The East Slavic tribes living within its sphere of influence, such as the Polyaenians, Drevlians, and Severians, paid tribute to the Khazars. It was against this historical backdrop that these East Slavic tribes gradually coalesced, laying the foundation for the future state of Kievan Rus. The Polyaenian tribe, centered around Kiev due to its advantageous geographical location, gradually became the most powerful among the East Slavic tribes. The ancient footprints, after thousands of years of trekking, finally converged on the banks of the Dnieper, and the dawn of civilization was about to illuminate this ancient land. Chapter 2. The Glory and Decline of Kievan Rus. In the 9th century, on the foundation of coalescing East Slavic tribes, a powerful state, Kievan Rus, emerged on the historical stage. Regarding its origin, the Norman Varangian factor played a significant role, as recorded in early historical sources like the Primary Chronicle. Legend has it that East Slavic tribes invited the Varangian Rurik and his brothers to rule. Rurik's successor, Oleg, captured Kiev in 882 CE, making it the capital and proclaiming it the mother of Rus cities. The early rulers of Kievan Rus, such as Ola, Iyer, Igor, Olga, and Sviatoslav, dedicated themselves to consolidating power, expanding territory, and establishing complex political, military, and trade relations with the powerful Byzantine Empire. Princess Ol was baptized into Christianity in Constantinople, paving the way for the Christianization of Rus. Her grandson, Grand Prince Volodymyr the Great, reigned c. 980-1015, made a historically profound decision. In 988 CE, Grand Prince Volodymyr officially declared Eastern Orthodox Christianity as the state religion and enforced its adoption. This event, known as the Baptism of Rus, had a decisive impact on the historical and cultural development of Kievan Rus and the entire East Slavic world. Choosing Eastern Orthodoxy allowed Kievan Rus to integrate into the Byzantine civilization, acquiring advanced culture, law, and art. The Slavonic alphabet, Cyrillic script, was introduced and popularized, laying the foundation for the flourishing of Rus literature and written culture. Churches and monasteries sprang up, becoming centers of education, culture, and art. Magnificent edifices such as St. Sophia's Cathedral and the Petrarch Glavra, Monastery of the Caves, in Kiev remain glorious testaments to Byzantine architectural art on Rus soil. The reign of Volodymyr's son, Yaroslav the Wise, reigned circa 1019 to 1054, marked the golden age of Kievan Rus. Yaroslav not only successfully repelled nomadic tribes like the Pecheneg and consolidated the state's territory, but also achieved great success in internal affairs and cultural construction. He compiled the first written law code of East Slavs, the Russkaya Pravda, Rus Justice. He vigorously built churches, monasteries, and schools, encouraging scholarly research and translation. Kiev became an important cultural and religious center in Eastern Europe. Yaroslav also, through extensive royal marriages, connected Kievan Rus with major European royal families, enhancing its international status. His daughters married kings of France, Norway, Hungary, and other countries, making Kievan Rus a significant player on the European political stage. During this period, the territory of Kievan Rus was unprecedentedly vast, stretching from the Black Sea in the south to the Baltic Sea in the north, the Volga River in the east, and the Carpathian Mountains in the west. The economy also developed, with agriculture, handicrafts, and trade all flourishing, especially trade along the Dnieper River's route from the Varangians to the Greeks, which brought great wealth to the state. However, prosperity followed by decline is a historical norm. After Yaroslav the Wise's death, the system of agnatic seniority he established failed to be effectively implemented, leading to frequent infighting among princes for the grand princely throne and territories. Kievan Rus gradually fragmented into a state of feudal appanage, splitting into multiple independent principalities, such as the Principality of Kiev, Chernihiv, Peryaslav, Halych Volhynia, Novgorod, and Vladimir Suzdal. Although the Grand Prince of Kiev nominally remained the supreme ruler of Rus, his actual power waned. Interprincely wars not only consumed national strength, but also provided opportunities for external forces to invade. Incursions by the Polovtsians, also known as Cumans, from the east became increasingly frequent, posing a serious threat to the southern borders of Rus. The great epic poem, The Tale of Ayer's Campaign, vividly depicts the tragic scene of Rus princes fighting against the Polovtsians. Despite internal and external threats, the culture of Kievan Rus continued to develop during the period of fragmentation. Each principality formed cultural centers with local characteristics, chronicle writing continued, and religious art and architecture also progressed. Particularly in the southwestern Principality of Halych Volhynia, due to its relatively western location, it was less affected by the Mongol invasion and, for a time, became an important custodian of Rus culture. In the early 13th century, the Mongol whirlwind from the east completely changed the course of Eastern European history. In 1223, the Mongol army first defeated the combined forces of Rus and Polovtsians at the Battle of the Kalkar River, but this was merely a prelude. From 1237 to 1240, Batı Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, led a massive Mongol army in a devastating conquest of the Rus principalities. Kiev was captured in December 1240 and subjected to brutal sacking and destruction. The once glorious mother of Rus cities was reduced to ashes. The vast majority of Rus principalities were forced to submit to the Golden Horde, Kipchak Khanate, established by the Mongols, beginning over 2 centuries of the Tatar yoke. Mongol rule had a profound impact on Rus society. On one hand, it brought immense destruction and population loss, retarding the socio-economic development of Rus. On the other hand, it objectively contributed to the rise of the Principality of Moscow in northeastern Rus and deeply influenced the political system of later Russia. For the Ukrainian lands, the Mongol invasion led to the complete disintegration of the political center of Kievan Rus, and different regions embarked on different paths of development. The southern steppe region remained under the direct control of the Golden Horde for a long time, while the northwestern Principality of Halych Volhynia, though maintaining relative independence for a while, eventually could not escape partition amidst maneuvering with the Mongols, Poland, Hungary, and Lithuania. The glorious era of Kievan Rus came to an end, its homeland mired in prolonged division and foreign rule, casting a heavy shadow over the future development of the Ukrainian nation. However, the cultural, religious, and national identity foundations laid by Kievan Rus were deeply rooted in the hearts of the Ukrainian people, becoming a spiritual source for future national revival. Chapter 3: The Shadow of Foreign Rule and the Rise of the Cossacks. After the Mongol invasion, the former lands of Kievan Rus fell into a long period of fragmentation and turmoil. The once unified Rus ceased to exist, and its various components embarked on different historical paths. For the lands constituting the core of modern Ukraine, the next several centuries would see them successively under the rule of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Kingdom of Poland, and later the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This period was one of suppression of national culture, but also a time when Ukrainian national consciousness gradually formed through resistance, and it nurtured the unique social group of the Cossacks. In the mid-13th century, as the Rus principalities groaned under the Mongol yoke, the Lithuanian tribes to the west gradually united and rapidly expanded, forming the powerful Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The Lithuanian Grand Dukes exploited the weakness of the Rus principalities and the loosening control of the Golden Horde to expand their power eastward and southward. By the second half of the 14th century, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania controlled vast Rus lands, including Kiev, Chernihiv, Volhynia, and Podylia. These regions constituted the vast majority of the Grand Duchy's population and territory. In the early period of Lithuanian rule, because Lithuanian nobles were relatively few and their culture comparatively less developed, they largely adopted Rus culture, laws, and administrative systems. The Ruthenian language, the common ancestor of Old Ukrainian and Old Belarusian, became one of the official languages, and the Eastern Orthodox faith was respected. Many Rus princes and nobles continued to hold important positions in the Grand Duchy, and social life was relatively stable. During this period, Rus traditional culture was preserved and developed to a certain extent. However, this situation changed with the union of Lithuania and Poland. In 1385, Grand Duke Jogaila of Lithuania married Queen Jadwiga of Poland and signed the Union of Krzywo. Jogaila converted to Catholicism and became King Ladislaw II Jagiello of Poland. This move aimed to unite the forces of Lithuania and Poland against their common enemy, the Teutonic Knights. Although Lithuania nominally maintained some independence, Polish political and cultural influence grew stronger. Catholicism was elevated, and Polish nobles began to penetrate Rus territories. In 1569, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland formally merged through the Union of Lublin, establishing the unified Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Rex Pospolita Obojga Narodow. According to the treaty, large swathes of Ukrainian land, including Volhynia, Podylia, and the Kiev region, were directly incorporated into the Kingdom of Poland, no longer belonging to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. This change had a profound impact on Ukrainian society. Polish nobles, szlachta, flocked to Ukrainian territories, seizing land and implementing serfdom. The plight of Ukrainian peasants worsened, their freedom greatly restricted, and their burdens increasingly heavy. Simultaneously, Poland also strengthened its control over Ukraine in cultural and religious spheres. Catholicism was vigorously promoted, and the status of Eastern Orthodoxy was suppressed. In 1596, under pressure and inducement from the Polish government, a portion of the Orthodox clergy signed the Union of Brest with the Roman Catholic Church, establishing the Eastern Rite Catholic Church, also known as the Greek Catholic Church or Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. This event led to a religious schism in Ukrainian society, with frequent conflicts between Orthodox believers, Eastern Rite Catholics, and Roman Catholics. The Polish language gradually replaced Ruthenian as the common language of officialdom and the upper classes, and Ukrainian native culture was discriminated against and marginalized. Against this social backdrop, peasants, townspeople, and some dispossessed Rus nobles, unable to bear the oppression of Polish nobles and religious discrimination, fled to the steppe region downstream of the Dnieper River, the so-called wild fields, Zajki Pola. This area was remote, sparsely populated, and a borderland where the influences of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Muscovy, and the Crimean Khanate intersected. The fugitives gradually formed a unique, semi-militarized social organization, the Cossacks, Ukrainian Gai Kozaki. The word Cossack originates from Turkic, meaning freeman or adventurer. They lived by fishing, hunting, and animal husbandry, but also engaged in raids and military activities. The Cossacks were brave and skilled warriors, proficient in horsemanship and naval warfare, gradually becoming an important military force. They established fortified military camps, Sich, on the Dnieper Islands, especially Khortytsia Island, the Zaporozhian Sich being the most famous. The Sich practiced military democracy, with the supreme leader, the Hetman, elected by the Cossack Council, Rada. The Cossacks not only resisted the raids of the Crimean Tatars, defending Ukraine's southern frontier, but also frequently launched uprisings against the rule of Polish nobles. From the late 16th to the first half of the 17th century, Cossack uprisings occurred one after another, growing in scale, such as the Kaczynski Uprising, 1591 to 1593, Nalivayko Uprising, 1594 to 1596, Pavliuk Uprising, 1637, and Austrianen Uprising, 1638. Although most of these uprisings ended in failure and were brutally suppressed by the Polish authorities, they tempered the Cossacks' military organizational capabilities and stimulated the Ukrainian people's national consciousness and spirit of resistance. Finally, in the mid-17th century, a national liberation war of unprecedented scale erupted. In 1648, under the leadership of the distinguished Cossack hetman Bohdan Khmelnytsky, a major uprising against the rule of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth broke out in Ukraine. Khmelnytsky allied with the Crimean Khanate, leading Cossack and peasant rebel armies. They successively defeated Polish forces at the battles of Zavdy Vody, Korsun, and Pilyavtsi, liberating most of Ukraine for a time and establishing a de facto Cossack state, the Hetmanate. This uprising was not only a social protest movement, but also possessed a profound national liberation character, aiming to achieve Ukraine's independence and autonomy. However, the nascent Hetmanate faced a grim internal and external situation. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was unwilling to accept defeat and continued its counterattacks. The Crimean Khanate, as an ally, was unreliable and often perfidious. In this situation, Khmelnytsky sought external aid, turning his gaze to Muscovy, which shared the Eastern Orthodox faith. In 1654, Khmelnytsky signed the Treaty of Pereyaslav with Tsar Alexei Mihailovich of Muscovy. According to the treaty, the Hetmanate recognized the Tsar's suzerainty in exchange for Moscow's military protection and a degree of autonomy. However, the interpretation of this treaty is a subject of great dispute in Ukrainian and Russian historiography. The Ukrainian side viewed it as a military and political alliance aimed at preserving Ukrainian autonomy, while the Muscovite side considered it Ukraine's return to the Russian motherland, the beginning of Ukraine's incorporation into Russia. The signing of the Treaty of Pereyaslav marked Moscow's intervention in Ukrainian affairs and triggered the long Russo-Polish War, 1654 to 1667. The war resulted in the Treaty of Andrusovo, 1667, which divided Ukraine along the Dnieper River. Left bank Ukraine, including Kiev, was ceded to Tsarist Russia, while right bank Ukraine remained under the control of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This division brought profound disaster to the Ukrainian nation, historically known as the Ruin. For decades thereafter, both banks of Ukraine were plagued by warfare and internal strife. The power of the Cossack hetmans was gradually weakened, and their autonomous status continually eroded. Although hetmans like Ivan Mazepa attempted to unite with external powers like Sweden to fight for Ukraine's independence, these efforts ultimately failed. By the end of the 18th century, with the three partitions of Poland by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, almost all of Ukraine, except for Galicia and other areas annexed by Austria, was incorporated into the Russian Empire. The Cossack traditions of autonomy and Ukraine's hopes for independence seem to have been completely extinguished. However, the spirit of freedom and national identity nurtured during the Cossack era had become deeply embedded in the Ukrainian national psyche, serving as an inexhaustible driving force for future national revival movements. Chapter 4: Struggle Under Imperial Shadows and the Awakening of National Consciousness. From the late 18th century to the early 20th century, the vast majority of Ukrainian lands were incorporated into the Russian Empire, while a small portion, mainly Galicia, Bukovina, and Transcarpathia, fell under the rule of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This was a period when Ukrainian national identity was suppressed and cultural development faced severe obstacles. But it was also a crucial stage for the tenacious awakening and development of Ukrainian national consciousness in adversity. In Russian-ruled Ukraine, the Tsarist government implemented strict centralization and Russification policies. During the reign of Catherine II, the remaining Cossack Hetmanate autonomy was completely abolished. In 1775, the Zaporozhian Sich was destroyed, the Cossack elite was integrated into the Russian nobility, and ordinary Cossacks became state peasants or were conscripted into the Russian army. Ukrainian administration was entirely remodeled according to the Russian pattern. Ukrainian lands were referred to as Malorussia, Little Russia, and Ukrainians were considered a branch of the Russian nation. The Tsarist government was committed to eliminating Ukrainian distinctiveness and promoting the Russian language and culture. In the 19th century, this cultural suppression intensified. In 1863, Tsarist Minister of Internal Affairs Pyotr Valyev issued a circular stating that a separate Little Russian language does not exist, has never existed, and cannot exist, banning the publication of popular science and religious books in Ukrainian. In 1876, Tsar Alexander II issued the even harsher EMSU case, which completely banned the publication of any books in the Ukrainian language, including literary works and translations, the staging of Ukrainian language plays, the teaching of Ukrainian in schools, and even strictly restricted the import of Ukrainian language publications from abroad. These repressive policies aimed to fundamentally stifle the Ukrainian language and culture and completely assimilate Ukrainians. However, oppression often breeds resistance. It was in such a harsh environment that the Ukrainian National Cultural Revival movement, National Revival, arduously emerged and grew. The pioneers of this movement, mainly from the intelligentsia, dedicated themselves to studying Ukrainian history, language, folklore, and literature, awakening the people's sense of national identity. Ivan Kotlяревsky's epic poem, Eneda, first part published in 1798, is considered the beginning of modern Ukrainian literature. He skillfully used colloquial Ukrainian to create a burlesque adaptation of Virgil's epic, vividly depicting the life and customs of the Ukrainian people and laying the foundation for the development of the Ukrainian literary language. In the first half of the 19th century, Kharkiv University became an important center for Ukrainian cultural revival. Scholars there actively collected and researched Ukrainian folk songs and historical documents, publishing many important academic works. The Brotherhood of Saints Cyril and Methodius, 1846 to 1847, centered around Mykola Kostomarov, Panteleimon Kulish, and Vasil Balazarsky, was the first secret organization in Ukraine with a clear political program. They advocated for the abolition of serfdom, the equal federation of all Slavic nations, and the cultural and political autonomy of Ukraine. Although the Brotherhood was quickly suppressed by the Tsarist government and its members exiled or imprisoned, their ideas had a profound impact on subsequent Ukrainian national movements. In this national revival movement, Taras Shevchenko, 1814 to 1861, was undoubtedly the most dazzling and influential giant. Born a serf, Shevchenko endured hardships, eventually gaining his freedom through the help of friends, and displayed exceptional talent in poetry and painting. His collection of poems, Kobzar, meaning folk singer, with its profound emotion, strong patriotism, and denunciation of social injustice, deeply touched the hearts of the Ukrainian people. He used poetry to glorify Ukraine's brilliant history, especially the Cossack era, exposed the darkness of Tsarist rule and the cruelty of serfdom, and called for national liberation and freedom. Shevchenko's poetry not only established the norms of the modern Ukrainian literary language, but, more importantly, he forged Ukraine's suffering and hope into immortal words, becoming a symbol of the Ukrainian national spirit and a cornerstone of national identity. For his involvement in the Brotherhood of Saints Cyril and Methodius, and for writing seditious poetry, Shevchenko was sentenced by the Tsarist government to 10 years of exile and banned from writing and painting. But his spiritual influence only grew stronger as a result. He is revered as Ukraine's national poet and prophet. In the second half of the 19th century, despite severe prohibitions like the EMS ukase, Ukrainian cultural activities did not completely cease. Intellectuals continued their cultural enlightenment and national propaganda work through secret societies like Hromada, private correspondence, and publishing abroad. Mikhail Drahomanov was an important thinker and social activist of this period. He advocated European-style federalism and socialist ideas, proposing that Ukraine develop on the basis of democracy and autonomy. Meanwhile, in western Ukraine, Galicia, Bukovina, under Austro-Hungarian rule, the situation was relatively more lenient. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a multi-ethnic state, and although national conflicts existed, its suppression of minority cultures was far less severe than in Tsarist Russia. The Ukrainian language could be used relatively freely in schools, publications, and public life. Lviv became an important center for Ukrainian cultural and political activities, hailed as Ukraine's Piedmont. Many cultural activities that were impossible in Russian-ruled Ukraine were carried out here. Academic institutions like the Shevchenko Scientific Society made significant contributions to organizing Ukrainian historical and cultural heritage and developing Ukrainian academic research. Ivan Franko and Lizia Ukrainka were outstanding representatives of Western Ukrainian literature during this period. Their works inherited and developed Shevchenko's tradition, profoundly reflecting the social life and spiritual pursuits of the Ukrainian people. However, Western Ukraine also faced its own challenges, mainly conflicts with Polish landowners and Austrian officials, as well as divisions among internal political factions, such as Russophiles, Ukrainophiles, and radicals. Nevertheless, Western Ukraine played an irreplaceable role in preserving and developing Ukrainian national culture and nurturing national elites, and it resonated with the national movement in Russian-ruled Ukraine. By the early 20th century, with the outbreak of the 1905 Russian Revolution, the Tsar's government was forced to make some concessions. Restrictions on Ukrainian language and culture were somewhat loosened, and Ukrainian language newspapers and books were briefly allowed to be published again. Ukrainian political organizations also began to operate openly, putting forward demands for autonomy and even independence. The seeds of national consciousness, after more than a century of arduous cultivation under imperial shadows, finally began to sprout, preparing to face the even more violent historical storms to come. The Ukrainian people's sense of their unique identity grew stronger, laying a solid ideological foundation for the independence struggles of the 20th century. Chapter 5: The Tumultuous 20th Century, Revolutions, Wars, and the Soviet Iron Curtain. For Ukraine, the 20th century was a period filled with violent upheavals, the trauma of war, a fleeting dawn of independence, and long Soviet rule. This land experienced the ravages of 2 world wars, the baptism of several revolutions, and one of the rarest famine tragedies in human history, finally ushering in the opportunity for independence at the end of the century. At the beginning of the century, with the outbreak of the 1905 Russian Revolution, Tsarist autocracy was shaken, and the Ukrainian national movement gained some room for development. Ukrainian language publications briefly flourished, and various political and social groups emerged, demanding cultural and even political autonomy. However, this lenient situation did not last long. during the Stolypin reaction, suppression of the Ukrainian national movement intensified again. In 1914, World War I broke out, and Ukraine once again became a battlefield for imperial powers. The Eastern Front's fires burned mainly on Ukrainian soil, where the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire engaged in a seesaw battle, bringing profound disaster to the Ukrainian people. Ukrainians were forced into opposing camps, slaughtering each other on the battlefield. The war's toll and the exacerbation of Russia's internal contradictions eventually led to the outbreak of the 1917 Russian Revolution. The February Revolution overthrew Tsarist autocracy, and Ukraine's national liberation movement saw an unprecedented opportunity. In March 1917, the Ukrainian Central Rada, Ukrainska Centralna Rada, was established in Kiev, chaired by the renowned historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky. The Central Rada initially sought autonomy for Ukraine within a future democratic Russia. However, as the Russian provisional government weakened and Bolshevik power rose, and as the external environment changed dramatically, the Central Rada stance became increasingly radical. On January 22, 1918, with Bolshevik forces approaching Kiev, the Central Rada issued its Fourth Universal, formally proclaiming the independence of the Ukrainian People's Republic, Ukrainska Narodna Respublika, UNR. This was the first time in Ukrainian history that a modern independent state was established. However, the nascent Ukrainian People's Republic faced an extremely difficult situation. It was under multiple pressures and military interventions from Bolshevik Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Poland, and various internal forces. To escape the Bolshevik army's offensive, the Central Rada signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, introducing German and Austrian troops in exchange for recognition of its independence and military support. But German occupation also brought new oppression. In April 1918, Germany supported Pavlo Skoropadsky's coup, overthrowing the Central Rada and establishing the Ukrainian state, the Hetmanate. Skoropadsky attempted to restore parts of the old order, but his rule was unstable. Meanwhile, in the western Ukrainian territories formerly belonging to Austria-Hungary, with the empire's collapse, the West Ukrainian People's Republic, Zakhidna Ukrainska Narodna Respublika, ZUNR, was proclaimed in Lviv in November 1918. On January 22, 1919, the Ukrainian People's Republic and the West Ukrainian People's Republic formally signed the Act Zluky, Unification Act, in Kiev's Sofiyska Square, declaring the unification of eastern and western Ukraine into a single state. This day is still celebrated as Ukraine's Unification Day, but the joy of unification was short-lived. Ukraine plunged into an unprecedentedly complex civil war and foreign armed intervention. Bolshevik Red Army forces, Denikin's White Army, Polish troops, French interventionist forces, and various local armed groups, like Makhno's peasant insurgents, fought chaotically across Ukrainian lands. The government of the Ukrainian People's Republic, the Directory, led by Simon Petlura, retreated step by step under the combined assault of various forces and was eventually forced into exile. By 1921, the Bolsheviks had largely controlled most of Ukraine and established the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, UKRSSR, as one of the founding members of the Soviet Union. Most of western Ukraine, Galicia, western Volhynia, was ceded to Poland under the Treaty of Riga, Bukovina to Romania, and Transcarpathia to Czechoslovakia. Ukraine was once again partitioned. During the early Soviet period, 1920s, the USSR implemented the new economic policy and the Ukrainization policy. Ukrainization aimed to win the support of the Ukrainian populace for Soviet power by promoting the use of the Ukrainian language and culture in education, publishing, administration, and other fields, and by cultivating Ukrainian local cadres. During this period, Ukrainian culture and arts experienced a degree of revival, with a cohort of outstanding writers and artists like Mykola Khvailovi and Les Kurbas emerging. This era is historically known as the Executed Renaissance, as many of them were later persecuted during Stalin's Great Purge. However, the good times did not last. From the late 1920s, Stalin implemented policies of forced agricultural collectivization and rapid industrialization. In Ukraine, collectivization met with strong peasant resistance. To crush peasant opposition and seize grain for export and industrial construction, the Soviet regime engineered a horrific famine in Ukraine between 1932 and 1933, known as the Holodomor, meaning to kill by starvation. Through forced grain requisitions, blockades of regions, and prohibitions on famine victims leaving, millions of Ukrainians, estimated between 3 to 7 million or even more, starved to death. This man-made famine is considered by many historians and Ukrainians as an act of genocide against the Ukrainian nation, leaving an indelible trauma and profound collective memory in Ukrainian society. Concurrently, Stalin launched large-scale political purges, during which large numbers of Ukrainian intellectuals, cultural elites, party and government officials, and ordinary citizens were arrested, exiled, and executed. Ukrainian national culture suffered unprecedented devastation. In 1939, World War II broke out. According to the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union invaded and occupied eastern Poland, including western Ukrainian territories. In 1940, the USSR annexed Bessarabia and northern Bukovina from Romania. These regions were incorporated into the Ukrainian SSR, nominally unifying most historically Ukrainian ethnic territories within one Soviet republic. In June 1941, Nazi Germany tore up the pact and launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Ukraine once again became the main battlefield, suffering brutal German fascist occupation and devastation. The Nazis implemented genocidal policies in Ukraine, carrying out massacres of Jews, such as the Bobbinier Massacre, communists, prisoners of war, and civilians, plundering resources and imposing forced labor. During the war, complex resistance movements also emerged in Ukraine. Some Ukrainian nationalists, like the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUNB, led by Stepan Bandera, attempted to use the German invasion as an opportunity to achieve independence and briefly declared a Ukrainian state in Lviv, but were quickly suppressed by the Germans. They subsequently formed the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, Ukrainska Povstanska Armia, UPA, which fought against both German occupiers and Soviet partisans, and continued to resist Soviet rule after the war until it was completely suppressed in the early 1950s. The UPA's activities are highly controversial in Ukrainian history, having aspects of resisting aggression for independence, but also a dark record of involvement in ethnic cleansing against Poles and others. After arduous battles, the Soviet Red Army recaptured all of Ukraine in 1944. The war brought immense loss of life and property to Ukraine. Millions of soldiers and civilians died, and cities and villages were reduced to ruins. After the war, Ukraine began the difficult task of reconstruction and became an important industrial and agricultural base for the Soviet Union. However, political repression and cultural Russification policies continued. During Khrushchev's thaw, mid-1950s to early 1960s, the political atmosphere eased somewhat. Some of those persecuted during the Stalin era were rehabilitated, and Ukrainian culture experienced a degree of revival. With the emergence of the 60ers, Shistesiatniki, generation of poets, writers, and artists who called for attention to national cultural traditions and humanitarian values. However, this thaw was limited and was soon replaced by tightened ideological control during the Brezhnev era, mid-1960s to early 1980s, and dissidents were suppressed. On April 26, 1986, an explosion occurred at the Kornabil, Chernobyl, nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine, causing the worst nuclear accident in human history. This disaster not only resulted in enormous ecological and health catastrophes, but also exposed the rigidity, bureaucracy, and lack of transparency of the Soviet system, severely shaking public trust in the Soviet regime and becoming a catalyst for the dissolution of the USSR and Ukrainian independence. The Kornabil accident awakened Ukrainian society's civic and environmental consciousness and exacerbated dissatisfaction with the centralized system. Against the backdrop of Gorbachev's policies of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, Ukraine's national democratic movement reemerged. In 1989, the People's Movement of Ukraine for Restructuring, known as RUK, was founded. Initially advocating for greater autonomy within the Soviet framework, it gradually shifted towards striving for full independence. Meanwhile, the revelation of historical truths, especially about the Holodomor, Stalinist repressions, etc., also galvanized national sentiment. The tumultuous waves of the 20th century had accumulated a century of humiliation, struggle, and longing for freedom in the hearts of the Ukrainian people, now erupting with unprecedented force, heralding the advent of a new historical era. Chapter 6: The Thorny Path to Independence and the Challenges of a Modern State. In the late 1980s, under the chain reaction triggered by Gorbachev's reforms, the Soviet Union's centralized system teetered, and a tide of national self-determination surged in various Union republics. As the second largest republic in the USSR in terms of population and economic strength, Ukraine's independence movement was pivotal to the fate of the Soviet Union. The profound impact of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, along with public discussion of historical crimes from the Stalinist era, especially the Holodomor, greatly stimulated the Ukrainian people's national consciousness and distrust of the central government in Moscow. The RUK movement, founded in 1989 under the leadership of intellectuals such as the renowned poet Ivan Drach, rapidly grew and became the main political force driving Ukrainian independence. They organized large-scale mass rallies and demonstrations, demanding an expansion of republic sovereignty and protection of the Ukrainian language and culture. On July 16, 1990, the Supreme Soviet Parliament of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic adopted the Declaration of State Sovereignty of Ukraine, proclaiming the supremacy of Ukrainian constitution and laws within its territory and stating Ukraine's right to its own army, financial system, and foreign policy. While not a full declaration of independence, it was a crucial step. In August 1991, the August coup occurred in Moscow, as Soviet hardliners attempted to prevent the country's disintegration through a coup d'état. The failure of the coup completely dismantled the authority of the Soviet central government. Seizing this historic opportunity, on August 24, 1991, the Supreme Soviet of Ukraine formally adopted the Act of Declaration of Independence of Ukraine, proclaiming Ukraine's secession from the USSR and its establishment as an independent, sovereign state. This day was designated as Ukraine's Independence Day. To give independence stronger legitimacy, a national referendum was held in Ukraine on December 1, 1991. The results showed that over 90% of voters, with a turnout as high as 84%, supported national independence, with most regions, including Crimea and the Russian-speaking eastern areas, voting in favor. On the same day, Ukraine also held its first presidential election, and Leonid Kravchuk, former ideologue of the Communist Party of Ukraine and then chairman of the Supreme Soviet, was elected as Ukraine's first president. A week later, the leaders of Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus signed the Belovezha Accords in Belarus, declaring the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the establishment of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CS. Newly independent Ukraine faced severe challenges. The transition from a planned economy to a market economy was extremely difficult, leading to severe inflation, production decline, and mass unemployment. Political system reform also faltered, and corruption became increasingly prominent. In terms of national identity, although independence received broad support, the close linguistic, cultural, and historical ties of the eastern and southern regions with Russia, as well as the special status of the Crimean Peninsula, transferred to Ukraine by Khrushchev in 1954, laid hidden dangers for future nation-building. In foreign relations, Ukraine pursued a balanced foreign policy, attempting to find equilibrium between Russia and the West. A thorny issue was the vast nuclear arsenal inherited from the Soviet Union. Ukraine was briefly the world's third-largest nuclear power. Under pressure from the United States, Russia, and other countries, and with security assurances Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances in 1994, agreeing to relinquish nuclear weapons in exchange for respect and guarantees of its sovereignty and territorial integrity from the US, Russia, and the UK. In 1994, amidst economic crisis and political discontent, Leonid Kuchma was elected as Ukraine's second president. During Kuchma's 10-year rule, the Ukrainian economy recovered somewhat after initial pains, and a new constitution was adopted in 1996, establishing a presidential parliamentary system. However, oligarchic power rose, corruption remained severe, and the gap between rich and poor widened. Kuchma attempted to maintain multi-vector diplomacy between Russia and the West, but contradictions between pro-Western and pro-Russian political forces within the country grew increasingly acute. The 2004 presidential election became a significant watershed in Ukraine's political development. The pro-Russian Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych was officially declared the winner, but the opposition accused the election of large-scale fraud. This triggered weeks of massive peaceful protests, historically known as the Orange Revolution. Ultimately, the Supreme Court of Ukraine annulled the election results, and a rerun was held. The pro-Western Viktor Yushchenko won the rerun, becoming president, with Yulia Tymoshenko as prime minister. The Orange Revolution was seen as a victory for Ukrainian civil society, boosting public political participation and advancing Ukraine's rapprochement with the West. However, the Orange Coalition soon fractured due to power struggles and policy disagreements, leading to political instability and slow reform progress. Economic problems remained prominent. In 2010, Yanukovych made a comeback in the presidential election, defeating Tymoshenko. After Yanukovych took office, Ukraine's domestic and foreign policies shifted, leaning towards Russia, and he suppressed the opposition. Tymoshenko and others faced political prosecution and imprisonment, raising concerns in Western countries. In late 2013, the Yanukovych government abruptly suspended the process of signing an association agreement with the European Union, instead seeking closer economic ties with Russia. This decision triggered massive pro-EU demonstrations, known as the Euromaidan Revolution, also known as the Revolution of Dignity. The demonstrations evolved from initial peaceful protests into violent clashes with police, resulting in serious casualties. In February 2014, after the situation spiraled out of control, Yanukovych fled Kyiv, and Parliament declared him removed from office, forming an interim government. Ukraine's political upheaval provided a pretext for Russian intervention. In March 2014, Russia swiftly dispatched troops to occupy Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula and, after orchestrating a so-called referendum, announced the annexation of Crimea. The international community widely condemned Russia's actions, deeming them a violation of international law and Ukrainian sovereignty. Subsequently, in Ukraine's eastern Donbass region, Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, with Russian support and direct involvement, pro-Russian separatist armed groups clashed with Ukrainian government forces on a large scale, declaring the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. This conflict lasted for 8 years, causing tens of thousands of deaths and displacing millions. In May 2014, Petro Poroshenko won the presidential election. He set countering Russian aggression, restoring territorial integrity, and promoting European integration as his main policy goals. During his tenure, Ukraine signed an association agreement with the EU and obtained visa-free travel to the EU. The Ukrainian military also underwent modernization reforms to counter the military threat in the east. However, domestic reforms progressed slowly, corruption remained severe, and public dissatisfaction with living standards persisted. In 2019, political newcomer and comedian Volodymyr Zelensky won the presidential election by a landslide, promising to fight corruption, end the Donbass War, and continue Ukraine's integration into Europe. However, the Donbass issue was not resolved through diplomatic efforts like the Minsk agreements, and tense relations with Russia continued. On February 24, 2022, After a long period of troop buildup on the border and manufactured tensions, Russia launched a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine under the pretext of demilitarization and denazification. The war quickly spread throughout Ukraine. This largest ground war in Europe since World War II brought unprecedented disaster to the Ukrainian people. Countless cities were bombed, infrastructure was destroyed, and millions of Ukrainians became refugees fleeing to neighboring countries. However, facing a powerful enemy, the Ukrainian military and civilians demonstrated tenacious resistance and astonishing resilience, receiving widespread international sympathy and aid. Russia's aggressive actions were met with strong condemnation and severe sanctions from the international community. This ongoing war is not only a barbaric violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but also a serious challenge to the post-World War II international order and the principles of international law. It has profoundly changed the geopolitical landscape of Europe and the world. For Ukraine, this is both a war for survival and independence, and a process in which its national identity is being finally forged and elevated in blood and fire. Through their indomitable struggle, the Ukrainian people have proven to the world their determination to defend freedom, democracy, and national sovereignty. The path to independence is fraught with thorns, but Ukraine's history shows that after countless hardships and trials, this nation can always rise again and move steadfastly towards the future it chooses for itself. The history of Ukraine is an epic of striving for survival through struggle and of a spirit tempered in suffering. From ancient steppes to modern battlefields, the people of this land have never relinquished their pursuit of freedom, independence, and dignity. Their story is far from over, and their spirit will continue to inspire the world. Thank you for listening. If you are interested in Ukrainian history and culture and more in-depth content, please subscribe to our channel to witness history and contemplate the future together with us.